Okay, Dennis, it seems that these supply chains for apparel, especially as they go to Southeast Asia, have become very complex. It's more than just a transaction between a buyer and a seller. There's agents involved, and there's transshippers involved, and there's representatives involved. For example, H&M, the Swedish retailer, some of whose labels were found in the rubble of the Rama Plaza building, has said that their order for that production was not an official order. It was transferred to that firm by an agent. So does this happen frequently? And is this a contribution to some of these problems?
Okay, let me separate what might be an H&M situation. And again, I don't know the specifics of H&M, so I will try to talk about major retailers versus smaller retailers. H&M is a relatively small retailer in the overall apparel industry, as opposed to a Target or a Gap Corporation or a Walmart. So first and foremost, let me go back to the complexity of sourcing. The reality is that sourcing has become more simplified because of having both direct sourcing as well as the approval rate of a factory and being an approved supplier. These suppliers have to be able to achieve not just a appropriate cost for product, but they must also be able to provide a supply chain that is very disciplined and very efficient. Most of the major retailers, in fact all the major retailers I'm familiar with, have very high standards on levels of efficiency and standards of performance. So if you're a major retailer, your expectation is that you'll be able to produce product at a competitive price, not necessarily the lowest price, but a competitive price, and be able to ship that on time of the right quality that's been agreed upon, and be able to have it on the retail floor of the retailer within a specific time period. That's the standard of operating. That's the price of admission to be able to perform at that level. Unfortunately, sometimes you have a smaller retailer who may be not dealing with a factory direct, may be going through an agent. And in that situation, they may not have the same kind of controls and disciplines built in. So you could have a situation that is very different than a Target working with a major supplier with approval and standards built within and check marks and inspections. You have a situation where a manufacturer has been used as a subcontractor without the knowledge of the retailer. A smaller retailer may not have the process in place to inspect and double check on those kinds of decisions. And if that takes place, which is not normally approved by, certainly not, must have approval by a major retailer on the front end. But if that does take place, and it does take place with smaller companies, then you could have a situation where a subcontractor is utilized that does not have approval by the retailer, and it may not be with the knowledge of the retailer that it has been subcontracted, and then you're open to things where you have a situation where the standards are not being upheld. And in that case, you're very vulnerable to violations in human rights and safety issues.
Well, that helps me understand things a lot. Thanks. Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I agree with Dennis's point that there are movements by especially large retailers to establish these global standards for their sourcing partners. But I do think that Dennis is taking a perspective based on his interaction with businesses and my interaction with Asian manufacturers. I've seen to some degree the idea that you have one face that you present when you're making the agreement or when you're interacting with your partner, and then maybe you have a different face when that partner's not there. And I think what sometimes can happen as this gets more and more complicated is there's just more and more distance involved in the process. Distance not just geographically, but culturally, politically, economically, a language perspective. So you're manufacturing your product not in a neighboring state, or not 3 states over, but all the way across the globe in a country that's fundamentally different from where you are, with management practices that are fundamentally different, and perspectives that are fundamentally different.
So let me follow up on that conversation a bit for the benefit of our viewers who may not be intimately familiar with the relative scale of these companies. And we said that Bangladesh annual garment apparel manufacturing production was in the neighborhood of $20 billion. Now, to help us understand the scale of that, how much retail volume in apparel would a company like Walmart do or Target do? And then on the other hand, how much would a smaller, even global, smaller retailer like H&M or Zara or Uniqlo do? What are the relative scales here?
Well, the individual volume by category of business is not published by Walmart or Target, but let me see if I can respond to the question in this regard. If H&M domestically is about $1.5 billion, let's compare that to Walmart, which is a corporation, is rapidly approaching $500 billion company, 500 or nearly $500 billion. A Old Navy division of Gap Corporation, Old Navy's published retail business is about $5.4 billion. I had the opportunity to lead a division within Walmart that I can talk about now that had a men's division that was over $5 billion. So when you start looking at that scale and then comparing it to a company that is a total company is only doing about 1.5 billion. 1.5 billion is a lot of money, but relative to the industry, it's small. And when you take Bangladesh, which is doing $20 billion totally, and that $20 billion is spread out over a rather large number of different retailers, these are relatively small businesses. So when you put it in perspective, you have a situation where the risk factor on that factory to lose an order from someone who is this small versus someone that may represent a very large percentage of their total business, that puts a little different perspective and a different pressure, and actually helps influence that supplier, that manufacturer, to adhere to the standards and expectations that should be taking place. Does that help?
Yes, it helps a lot. Dan, any other observations on that issue, scale and power?
I think there's also a context at a country level. So Bangladesh, their only ball in the game is textile production. It's around 80% or so of all of their exports. About 70% of the entire economy in Bangladesh is in agriculture. It's a least developed country, and it's primarily rural agriculture workers. But out of that remaining 30%, 3/4 of them are in the textile industry. So 3/4 of all the what we would kind of consider jobs in the developing world in Bangladesh are in the textile industry. And then their second largest industry after textiles is shipbuilding, to help ship those products to export those products to countries. So when you're talking about scale and you're trying to get some perspective on this issue and this problem, I think it's important to realize the role that textiles play in Bangladesh.
If the apparel manufacturing industry in Bangladesh is $20 billion, 80% of their exports, and it accounts for a large proportion of the country's employment, I would think that the government officials and the business officials and leaders would be incented to meet those standards that Dennis talked about so that they could attract more volume and not lose the business they've got. So why aren't these standards being enforced? Why aren't these standards being established and followed in these factories?
Dan, you want to take it first, or?
Dennis, why don't you go first one, I think.
There is the incentive that if you're going to participate, if you're going to develop the business, you're going to have to step up and be competitive with those standards. That's the bottom line. And most of the governments that these major retailers do business with are very much aware that that's the expectation. So you are seeing changes that take place. The standards that may have existed in China 15 years ago had changed dramatically over the last 15 years. They've changed dramatically just in the last 5 years. The standards that exist in Indonesia have changed dramatically in the last 5 years. The standards that exist in South and Central America have changed dramatically. And part of that has been because the business leaders within those countries know that they have to step up to be able to be a participant, pay the price of admission. But they are also getting support from governments many times that subsidize these factories and help them achieve improvements in their factories, or if there's safety issues, or construction of factories, dormitories, whatever. Or it's not uncommon to see that some support takes place. So the countries do respond, both from a political standpoint, from a government standpoint, as well as the owners of the factories. So they do realize that they have to do it if they're going to be able to develop that business. Unfortunately, you have cases where it's not being done, or a case where it wasn't being done properly, and you have a disaster. If anything, the disaster that recently took place in Bangladesh would force the government to take a more active role to help subsidize factories, to help ensure that the standards are being achieved, because they recognize without being able to adhere to those standards, they're not going to get the business. And they're going to lose the tax base, the growth opportunities for the development of their industries within their own country. So it's a situation where they just have to. And if they're not going to, they recognize they will not develop this segment of their business and their economy.
Yeah, and I agree with Dennis, and I think it's important to note that these are the exceptions, not the rule. That Bangladesh has around 5,000 factories manufacturing textiles, and this was one or two bad actors. And this is not the typical activity in Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, El Salvador, whatever country we want to be talking about that does do this global, as part of this global sourcing. And Bangladesh is a sophisticated textile producer. They've been doing this since 1977, 76. So they've been involved in this as long as I've been alive, basically. So they're a sophisticated country, a sophisticated producer within the textile industry. That said, I think global standards are not how these companies differentiate or compete. It's a baseline that once met, then you can start to compete on other standards. If it was based solely on meeting these standards of worker safety, these other issues, you still see a lot of textile manufacturing in developed countries. And you don't. You don't see developed countries doing much textile manufacturing. It's a very small percentage, very small numbers. So once you meet that standard, you're kind of allowed to play in the game. And then you're competing based on price. And that's why you see this global movement of production to the newest kind of low-cost country, what's sometimes referred to again as the China price.